The sun was a hammer, and the town of Redemption was its anvil. It beat down on the raw timber of the single street, on the warped planks of the station platform, and on the fine silk of Maylene's dress, a garment the color of dried blood that felt like a shroud in the oppressive heat. She stood where the man with the sweat-stained collar had left her, next to a stack of freight bound for someplace else, a place with more trees and less dust. The air was a thick stew of smells: hot iron from the rails, manure from the livery, stale whiskey seeping through the saloon doors, and the overarching scent of baked earth, a mineral tang that coated the back of her throat. She was a parcel, delivered and awaiting collection. Her hands, hidden in the long sleeves of her dress, were clenched into small, tight fists, the only outward sign of the cold terror that coiled in her stomach. Her world had shrunk to this sliver of scorched wood, a purgatory between the suffocating darkness of the train car and an unknown, but surely no better, future. Men passed, their boots scuffing a rhythm of disinterest or, worse, slow appraisal. They looked at her the way a rancher might look at new livestock, their eyes lingering on her foreignness, on the pale oval of her face, and the dark, straight fall of her hair. She was an exotic bird with clipped wings, set down in a land of hawks and vultures. She kept her gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon, on the place where the brassy sky bled into the brown, bruised knuckles of the distant mountains. To look at them, to meet their eyes, would be to acknowledge her own status as property, a thing to be valued and claimed. She would not give them that. Inside her, beneath the fear, a small hard kernel of defiance remained, a seed she had nurtured across an ocean and a continent. The man who had brought her, a portly agent for the railroad named Mr. Thorne, had assured her this was a respectable arrangement. He had used words like contract and ward, but his eyes had held the flat, transactional gleam she had come to recognize in men who dealt in flesh. The man she was to meet, a Mr. Ethan Cole, was a homesteader, a man of some means who required a companion. A wife, Thorne had implied without ever using the word. The contract, a document of lies, written in a language she could barely decipher, had been signed with her thumbprint in a grimy office in San Francisco. It was a chain, forged in ink and desperation. Now she waited for the man who held the other end of it. The sun crawled across the sky, a merciless eye, and the shadows of the buildings stretched like grasping fingers across the dusty street. Still, no one came for her. Hours bled into one another. The initial knot of fear in her gut loosened into a dull, aching dread. The town's activity slowed as the afternoon heat peaked, the sounds becoming muted and sluggish. A dog panted in the sliver of shade beneath the platform. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer down the street was the only steady heartbeat in the dying town. She wondered if this was the true trick, to be left here to bake into the landscape, to be forgotten until she simply ceased to exist. Perhaps this Ethan Cole had changed his mind. Perhaps he had seen her from a distant window, a fragile porcelain doll unsuited for this raw, brutal country, and decided against the purchase. The thought brought a flicker of something she dared not name hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the practical terror of her situation. Alone, penniless, and a stranger in this hostile land, she was as good as dead. Her survival depended on being claimed. Just as the sun began to relent, dipping toward the jagged peaks of the mountains, a rider emerged from the shimmering haze at the end of the street. He did not move with the swagger of the town men. He rode a tall, dark horse, and his posture was one of weary endurance, as if he and the animal were carved from the same piece of weathered rock. He was a silhouette at first, a specter conjured from the heat and dust. As he drew closer, details resolved themselves through the haze. He wore a plainsman's hat, its brim pulled low, casting his face in deep shadow. His coat was worn, his trousers patched. He was not a man of means, as Thorne had promised. He looked like the land itself, hard, unforgiving, and stripped of all that was unnecessary. He pulled his horse to a halt before the station, the animal's hooves making soft, thudding sounds in the thick dust. He dismounted in a single, fluid motion that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. He was taller than she had expected, his shoulders broad beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. He looped the reins around the hitching post, his movements economical and precise. For a long moment, he simply stood there, letting his horse drink from the trough, his back to her. He seemed to be studying the town, or perhaps gathering himself for an unpleasant task. Maylin felt her breath catch. This had to be him. There was an aura of solitude about him that set him apart from the loud, boisterous men who drifted in and out of the saloon. When he finally turned, his face was revealed. It was a map of hardship, etched with lines around his eyes and mouth. His beard was trimmed short, flecked with gray, and his eyes, when they finally fell upon her, were the color of a winter sky, pale and startlingly clear. They held no warmth, no welcome, only a deep, bottomless weariness. He looked at her, then at the small, battered trunk at her feet, the only possession she had in the world. His gaze was not leering, not even assessing. It was the look of a man confirming an unwelcome reality. There was no Mr. Thorne in sight, only her, standing alone on the platform. A piece of paper, weighted down by a rock, fluttered on a nearby crate. He walked over to it, his steps slow and deliberate. He picked it up, his large, calloused hands surprisingly steady as he unfolded the single sheet. His eyes scanned the contents, his expression unchanging, a mask of stoic resignation. He read it once, then again, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into a different meaning. Then he crumpled the paper in his fist. He finally spoke, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. Thorne is gone. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. She gave a single small nod, not trusting her own voice. The chasm of silence that stretched between them was vast and unnerving. He looked from her to the empty street, then back again. A muscle worked in his jaw. She could see the conflict in him, the warring impulses of a man bound by a deal he now clearly regretted. This was not the meeting she had been told to expect. There was no greeting, no pretense of civility. There was only this raw, awkward confrontation under the dying sun. He was a stranger, and she was his burden. He gestured with his head toward his horse. The wagon broke an axle, 10 miles out. Another complication, another test. She looked at the tall horse, then down at her silk dress and thin, impractical shoes. She had ridden a horse only once in her life, a plodding farm animal in the village of her childhood. This creature was different. It was powerful, restless, its dark eyes intelligent and wary. To ride it would be an ordeal, an indignity. To refuse would be to show weakness, to prove herself the useless trinket he already believed her to be. She met his gaze, holding it for a fraction longer than was comfortable, a silent declaration that she was not as fragile as she appeared. She walked toward the horse, her movements stiff but deliberate. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. He seemed to expect a protest, tears, a plea to be left behind. When none came, a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or a grudging respect, passed through his cold eyes. He did not offer her a hand. He simply stood by the horse's head, waiting to see what she would do. Gathering the cumbersome fabric of her dress in one hand, she placed her foot in the stirrup. The leather was worn and smooth. She pulled herself up, a clumsy, graceless movement that sent a jarring pain through her tired muscles. But she made it. She settled onto the wide, hard saddle, her heart pounding against her ribs. She sat astride the animal, a scandalous posture for a woman of her upbringing, but there was no other way. Dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered. He untied the reins and swung himself up behind her, his movements effortless. His presence was a solid, unnerving weight at her back. She could feel the heat of his body, smell the faint, clean scent of sage and leather that clung to him. He reached around her, his arms caging her in as he took the reins. "Hold on," he commanded, his voice low and close to her ear. The horse shifted beneath them, and she instinctively gripped the saddle horn, her knuckles white. With a soft click of his tongue, he urged the horse forward, away from the station, away from the last outpost of a civilization that had sold her and abandoned her. The town of Redemption, with its false promises and hollow name, receded behind them, swallowed by the dust of their departure. The world beyond the town was vast and terrifying. The landscape opened up into an endless expanse of sagebrush and rock, stretching to a horizon that seemed to get no closer, no matter how long they rode. The mountains loomed, their peaks turning a bruised purple in the twilight. The only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves, the creak of the leather saddle, and the whisper of the wind as it stirred the dry grasses. The silence was heavier than any noise, filled with the unspoken tension between them. He was a wall of muscle and grim resolve at her back, and she was a rigid line of fear and defiance in his arms. They were two solitary creatures, bound together by a piece of paper and the unforgiving wilderness. As they traveled, she watched the land, committing its harsh beauty to memory. It was a place of stark contrasts, the delicate silver green of the sage against the brutal red of the rock formations, the deep velvet shadows that pooled in the coulees, and the brilliant dying blaze of the sun on the western rim of the world. The land did not care for her. It did not care for him. It was an impartial witness to their small, desperate journey. It had existed long before them and would remain long after they were gone. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Her own suffering felt insignificant against the backdrop of such ancient, monumental indifference. She began to understand the man behind her, to see how a place like this could shape a person, sanding away all softness, leaving only what was essential for survival. He rode with an easy, ingrained competence, navigating the broken country as if by instinct. He seemed to read the terrain, choosing paths that were invisible to her. His vigilance was constant. His head was always moving, his eyes scanning the horizon, the ridgelines, the shadows. He was not merely traveling through this land, he was a part of it, as alert and wary as any predator. She, in turn, focused on enduring. The saddle chafed her legs, and a deep ache settled in her spine. Every muscle screamed in protest. The wind grew cold as the last of the light faded, and her thin dress offered little protection. Yet she made no sound. She did not complain, or shift, or sigh. She matched his silence with her own, turning her misery into a private, internal battle. She would not give him the satisfaction of her weakness. He must have sensed her shivering. He reined the horse to a stop in the lee of a towering rock formation that shielded them from the wind. He dismounted, and for a moment she thought he might leave her there. Instead, he unstrapped a bedroll from behind the saddle. He shook out a thick woolen blanket, its rough texture a world away from her fine silk. He handed it up to her without a word. Their fingers brushed, his skin rough and warm against her cold hand. The brief contact was like a spark, a startling reminder of their shared humanity in this vast emptiness. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, the coarse wool scratching her skin, but its warmth was a profound relief, a small act of mercy in a merciless world. He took a canteen from his saddlebag and offered it to her. The water was cool and tasted of metal, the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. He only grunted in response, but it was enough. The gesture had cracked the wall of his stony silence, letting in a sliver of light. They rode on into the darkness, the world reduced to the pale ribbon of the trail under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to tear holes in the black fabric of the sky. The silence returned, but it was different now. The small gestures of the blanket and the water had changed its texture. It was no longer a silence of hostility, but one of shared hardship, a quiet truce between two strangers, lost in the wilderness. She found herself relaxing against him, just slightly, her body unconsciously seeking his warmth and the solid reassurance of his presence. She was exhausted, her body a single, throbbing ache, and she drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse and the unexpected security of being held by her captor. She awoke with a start when the horse stopped. Her head had been resting against his chest, and she pulled away, embarrassed. Before them, nestled in a shallow valley, was a single point of light, a small golden square against the immense darkness. It was a window. They had arrived. As they drew closer, she could make out the shape of a small cabin, its log walls dark and solid, with a plume of smoke rising from a stone chimney to dissolve into the starry sky. A larger, darker shape loomed behind it, a barn. This was his home, his sanctuary. It was smaller than she had imagined, the tiny, fragile outpost of human endeavor against the crushing weight of the wilderness. Her heart, which had been buoyed by the small kindness on the trail, sank once more. This was to be her prison. He dismounted and then reached up to help her down. His hands spanned her waist, lifting her from the saddle as if she weighed nothing. He set her on her feet, but her legs, numb and weak from the long ride, buckled beneath her. He caught her, his arm a steel band around her, holding her steady until she found her balance. He released her quickly, as if her touch had burned him, and turned his attention to unsaddling the horse. He did not lead her to the main cabin, the one with the welcoming light in the window. Instead, he picked up her small trunk and walked toward a second, much smaller structure she hadn't noticed at first, set some 50 yards away from the house. It was a tiny one-room shack, little more than a shed. He pushed open the door, which creaked in protest, and stepped inside. A moment later, a match scraped, and the warm glow of a lantern filled the small space. He placed her trunk at the foot of a narrow cot. The shack was Spartan, but it was immaculately clean. There was the cot, a small table with a single chair, and a small pot-bellied stove in the corner, a neat stack of firewood beside it. The fire was already laid, waiting for a match. On the table sat a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a pitcher of water. He had prepared this for her. He had expected her. He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, iron key. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he pointed to the inside of the door, where a sturdy new lock had been installed, its brass shining in the lantern light. The key was in the lock, on her side. He looked at her then, his winter sky eyes meeting hers in the flickering light. He said nothing, but the gesture spoke volumes. He was giving her a choice. He was giving her security. He was not her captor. He was her reluctant host. He was a man of honor, trapped in a dishonorable arrangement. With a final brief nod, he pulled the door closed, leaving her alone in her sanctuary. The sound of his footsteps faded as he walked back to his own house. Mei Lin turned the key in the lock. The solid metallic click was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound of a promise. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Each morning, when she awoke, she would find a bucket of fresh milk and a few eggs on the small stoop outside her door. He was a ghost, providing for her needs without ever intruding on her space. She would watch him from her window as the sun rose, a solitary figure moving with relentless purpose. He worked from dawn until dusk, his energy seemingly inexhaustible. He mended fences, tended to his small herd of cattle, chopped wood, his movements a symphony of practiced efficiency. He was a man in constant motion, as if stillness would allow the ghosts that haunted him to catch up. Her initial fear began to transform, evolving into a state of careful, analytical observation. She was a student of his habits, his moods. She learned the slump of his shoulders meant weariness. The taut set of his jaw meant frustration, with a stubborn piece of machinery. She saw him not as a monster or a savior, but as a man, profoundly alone and burdened by a sorrow so deep it had become a part of his very bones. She watched him with his animals, the tall, dark horse, a handful of chickens, a scruffy dog that shadowed his every step. With them, he was different. His hands, which were so rough and capable when mending a fence, became gentle. His voice, when he spoke to the horse, lost its gravelly edge, softening into a low murmur. In these moments, she saw a flicker of the man he might have been before the world had broken him. The line shack, her small prison, slowly became her own. She scrubbed the floorboards until they were pale, polished the single window pane until it gleamed, and kept the small space meticulously neat. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a way of imposing her own order on a world that had become chaotic and terrifying. She was reclaiming her agency, one small, deliberate act at a time. Her trunk contained little of practical value, a few silk dresses, useless in this rugged landscape, and a small wooden box. Inside the box were her only treasures, a set of small, sharp carving knives and a photograph of her parents, their faces already fading, becoming ghosts of a life that no longer existed. She began to carve. She took scraps of wood from the woodpile, soft pieces of pine and aspen, and with her small, sharp blades, she coaxed them into life. She carved birds, their wings outstretched in flight, their forms so delicate they looked as if they might take to the air. It was a language she had learned from her grandfather, a way of speaking without words, of shaping her grief and her hope into something tangible. The small pile of wooden birds on her windowsill grew, a flock of silent witnesses to her lonely vigil. It was an act of creation in a place that seemed dedicated to mere survival. Weeks turned into a month. The silence between them remained, a vast, unbridged canyon, but their awareness of each other grew. He would leave an extra piece of firewood if the night promised a chill. She would see him glance toward her window as he returned from the fields at dusk, as if to confirm the small light of her lamp was still burning. They were two planets in a solitary orbit, held in place by a gravity of shared isolation. One evening, emboldened by a courage she didn't know she possessed, she decided to bridge the gap. She took the most perfect of her carved birds, a tiny sparrow with intricate feathers, and left it on the stoop next to the empty milk pail. It was not a payment or a plea. It was a declaration. I am here. I am a person, not a piece of property. I can create beauty. The next morning, the bird was gone. In its place, beside the usual milk and eggs, was a small leather-bound book. The cover was worn smooth with use, the pages softened at the edges. She opened it carefully. It was filled with drawings, detailed and precise, of the local flora. Each plant was rendered in pencil, with notes in a neat masculine hand describing its properties, which were edible, which were medicinal, which were poison. It was his book, his knowledge, his way of seeing the world. It was an offering, an answer to her own. He was showing her how to survive in this place. He was giving her a key to his world, just as he had given her the key to her door. A week later, the first snows of winter dusted the high peaks of the mountains, a stark white warning of the cold to come. He approached her shack in the late afternoon, the first time he had done so since her arrival. He stopped a respectful distance from the door, his hat in his hands. Maylin opened the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He looked uncomfortable, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. Winter is coming, he stated, his voice rough. You can't stay here. The stove is too small. You'll freeze. She waited, her mind racing. Was he sending her away? Back to redemption? The thought was terrifying. He must have seen the fear in her eyes because he quickly added, There's a room in the house. You can have it. He still didn't look at her, his discomfort palpable. He was a man who lived by a strict, self-imposed code, and this situation was testing its every boundary. But there was another reason for his visit. From his pocket, he pulled a folded, official-looking document. It was the contract from Thorne, the deed of sale. He walked to the small fire pit she used for cooking on warmer days. He knelt, struck a match, and held the flame to the corner of the paper. He held it as it burned, the ink blackening, the words of her bondage curling into ash. He didn't drop it until the flames licked at his fingertips. He looked up at her then, his gaze direct and unwavering. The firelight danced in his winter sky eyes. That man had no right. No one has that right. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. You are free. You can leave whenever you wish, but the passes will be snowed in within a month. To try and cross the mountains before spring would be suicide. He stood up, dusting the ash from his hands. The choice is yours. Stay or go. But you are not a prisoner here. He turned and walked away, leaving her with the smell of smoke and the astonishing, terrifying reality of her own freedom. The day the riders came, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, heavy and pregnant with snow. A bitter wind howled down from the mountains, stripping the last of the autumn leaves from the cottonwood trees that grew along the creek bed. Maylin had been in the main house for 2 weeks, occupying a small, sparse room at the back that had clearly been unused for a very long time. The move had been as silent and awkward as everything else between them. He had carried her trunk over, set it down, and retreated to the barn, leaving her to acclimate to the new space, a space that smelled of dried herbs and old memories. The house was saturated with his grief. She could feel the ghost of his wife, Sarah, in the faded curtains, in the worn spot on the floor by the hearth, in the way he sometimes paused in a doorway, his eyes unfocused, lost in a past she could never know. She saw them first, two figures on horseback cresting the ridge to the east. They were not neighbors. No one ever came to this isolated valley. These men rode with a purpose that felt like a threat, their dark coats flapping in the wind like carrion wings. She felt a cold dread snake up her spine. She didn't run to Ethan, who was in the barn sharpening an axe blade. Instead, she walked calmly back to her room. From beneath the loose floorboard under her cot, she retrieved a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. Her hands were steady as she unwrapped it, revealing a small, intricately engraved pistol, a gift from her father, a man who had understood that the world was full of predators. Tucked beside it was a box of cartridges. She checked the weapon, her movements practiced and sure, and slipped it into the deep pocket of the simple wool dress she had sewn for herself. Then, and only then, did she walk to the barn. He saw the look on her face and needed no other explanation. The rhythmic scrape of the whetstone on steel stopped. He set the axe down and straightened up, his eyes immediately going to the ridge. Get in the house, he said, his voice flat and hard. Bar the door. He strode toward the cabin, pulling his rifle from the leather scabbards by the door. She did not obey. She stood her ground, her hand resting on the cold steel in her pocket. There are two of them, she said, her own voice calm and even. He glanced at her, a flash of irritation in his eyes. I said, get in the house. I can shoot, she stated simply. He gave a short, dismissive laugh, a harsh, ugly sound. With what? A needle. The riders were closer now, close enough to see the rifles resting in the crooks of their arms. They were hard men, their faces cruel and confident. One of them she recognized with a jolt of pure terror. He had been with Thorne on the train, a hulking brute with a scarred face. They reined in their horses 100 yards from the cabin, a safe distance. Cole, the scarred man yelled, his voice carrying on the wind. Silas Thorne sends his regards. He's come to collect his property. Ethan raised his rifle, resting it on the top rail of the corral fence. He didn't answer. His silence was more menacing than any threat. Don't be a fool, homesteader. She ain't worth dying for. Just send out the little China doll, and we'll be on our way. The first flakes of snow began to fall, thick and wet, melting on the dark ground. The world was shrinking, the horizon disappearing behind a curtain of white. This is your last chance, Cole. Ethan remained motionless, a statue carved from granite. The scarred man grew impatient. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot was a sharp crack that echoed off the hills, and a splinter of wood flew from the fence post, inches from Ethan's head. Without hesitation, Ethan fired back. His shot was deliberate, unhurried. The scarred man's horse screamed and collapsed, shot clean through the neck. The man tumbled to the ground, cursing. The second rider, seeing his advantage lost, opened fire, sending a spray of bullets toward the cabin. Ethan ducked behind the solid wall of the barn as bullets thudded into the logs. I told you to get inside, he roared at Mei Lin over the gunfire. The first real blizzard of the season was upon them now, the wind shrieking, the snow falling in a blinding sheet. The world beyond the corral was a swirling vortex of white. They were trapped. The second gunman, using the storm for cover, was working his way around the side of the barn. Ethan was pinned down, able to see the front, but blind to the flank. Mei Lin saw the man's dark shape moving through the snow, a phantom gliding toward them. There was no time to explain, no time for permission. She pulled the pistol from her pocket, her hand a steady extension of her will. She raised it, took aim at the fleeting shadow, and fired twice. The reports of the small pistol were sharp and distinct against the deeper boom of the rifles. The shadow in the snow stumbled, cried out in surprise and pain, and fell. Silence descended, broken only by the howl of the wind and the pained groans of the wounded man. Ethan stared at her, his rifle still held at the ready. His face was a mask of disbelief. He looked from her to the small smoking pistol in her hand, to the spot where the second man had fallen. The scarred man, his leg pinned beneath his dead horse, began to scream threats and curses, his voice distorted by the storm. Ethan ignored him. His gaze was fixed on her. The woman he had seen as a fragile burden, a delicate doll, had just saved his life with a cold, lethal efficiency that matched his own. The world had tilted on its axis. Stay here, he ordered, his voice different now, stripped of its arrogance, holding a new note of caution. He moved from the cover of the barn, keeping low, his rifle sweeping the area. The storm was a solid wall of white now, visibility down to a few feet. He made his way to the fallen man, who was clutching a shattered knee, his rifle lost in the snow. Ethan disarmed him without a word. He then moved to the first man, who was struggling to free himself from under his horse. He kicked the man's rifle away and stood over him, a grim judge in the swirling snow. There was no mercy in his face. These men had brought violence to his sanctuary. They had threatened her. He marched them both toward the small root cellar dug into the side of the hill. He shoved them inside, their protests and pleas lost to the wind. He slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, entombing them in the cold darkness. When he returned to the cabin, he was covered in a layer of snow, his face grim. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a cold, stark reality. They were alone, trapped by the storm with two violent men imprisoned just yards away. He looked at Mei Lin, who was calmly reloading her pistol by the firelight. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice quiet. "My father was a soldier," she replied, not looking up. "He taught me that the best way to survive is to be the predator, not the prey." The blizzard raged for 3 days. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist, replaced by the relentless, keening howl of the wind and the suffocating whiteness that pressed against the windows. The cabin became their entire universe, a small, warm island in a sea of frozen fury. The forced proximity should have been awkward, but the shared violence had burned away all pretense. They moved around each other with a new, unspoken understanding. He tended the fire, brought in more wood, and rationed their food. She cleaned their wounds, a graze on his arm from a ricochet, her touch gentle and sure. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of what had happened, of what they had learned about each other. On the second night, the storm reached its peak. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the cabin groaned under the weight of the snow. The fire cast long dancing shadows on the walls. Ethan sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical, calming. He hadn't slept. He sat watch, his ears attuned to the storm and the faintest sound from the cellar. Mei Lin sat by the hearth, watching the flames. The warmth could not touch the cold knot of memory that the blizzard had awakened in her. "The snow," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "It reminds me of home. The mountains there were just as cruel." He stopped his work, looking at her. The firelight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing the deep well of sorrow in his eyes. "This storm," he began, his voice low and raspy, "is just like the one." He didn't need to explain. She knew he was speaking of his past, of the ghosts that haunted this house. He set down the rifle and stared into the fire, his gaze turned inward. "I was on a cattle drive. Should have been back a week sooner, but we were caught on the plains. Sarah, my wife, she was here, with our boy, Sammy." He choked on the name, the sound of raw physical pain. "It was diphtheria. The doctor was in Redemption, a day's ride away. She couldn't get to him. The snow was too deep. She couldn't even get out to the well for fresh water." He fell silent, the weight of his unshed tears filling the small room. "When I finally made it back, the snow was up to the eaves, the house was cold, the fire had been out for days." He looked at Mei Lin, his eyes filled with a desolation that mirrored the storm outside. "I found them in their bed. She was holding him. They had frozen. I built this place with my own 2 hands to keep them safe, and it became their tomb, because I wasn't here." The confession hung in the air between them, a raw, vulnerable nerve exposed to the world. He was not just a stoic, hard man. He was a man hollowed out by grief and guilt, living a life of penance for a sin he did not commit. Malin felt her own carefully constructed walls crumble. His pain resonated with her own, with the loss of her family, her home, her life. They were two survivors, scarred by different fires but bearing the same wounds. She stood up and walked to the hearth. She refilled his cup with hot coffee, her movements slow and deliberate. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple, fleeting touch. He flinched, as if unused to human contact, then sagged under her hand, a great shuddering breath escaping him. In that moment, in the heart of the raging storm, two solitary souls found a brief, fragile shelter in each other. The blizzard had tried to bury them, but instead, it had unearthed the truth. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, the world was transformed. A profound cathedral-like silence had fallen, the landscape buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The sun, when it rose, struck the snow with a light so brilliant it was painful to behold. The world felt clean, scoured, reborn. The violence and the fear of the past few days seemed like a bad dream. Ethan went out first, his rifle in hand. The snow was waist deep, and he moved through it with difficulty. He checked the cellar. It was silent. The two men, Thorne's hired guns, had frozen to death in the night. He felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, They were just another part of the harsh calculus of survival. He buried them in a deep snowdrift behind the barn, their final resting place until the spring thaw. When he returned to the cabin, Maylin had a pot of coffee brewing and a pan of biscuits baking in the small oven. The simple domesticity of the scene was so jarringly normal, it stopped him in his tracks. This house, which had been a mausoleum of grief for so long, felt different. It felt like a home. She didn't look up as he came in, but she poured a cup of coffee and set it on the table for him. The gesture was simple, comfortable, an acknowledgement of a new reality between them. The separation was gone. The line shack, barely visible as a mound of white across the yard, was a relic of a former life. She had not returned to it, and he had not expected her to. Her place was here now. The days that followed were filled with the hard work of digging out. They shoveled paths from the house to the barn to the well, their movements falling into an easy, collaborative rhythm. They worked together, a team forged in crisis. He taught her things. He showed her how to track animals in the snow, how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds, how to split wood with a clean single stroke of the axe. She was a quick study, her hands nimble, her mind sharp. In turn, she brought a quiet order to his chaotic life. She mended his worn clothes, cooked meals that were more than mere sustenance, and filled the silent house with a gentle, unobtrusive presence. Their new language was one of actions, not words. A pot of stew left simmering on the stove was a declaration of care. A pile of freshly split firewood stacked by the door was a promise of protection. They learned the contours of each other's sorrows without ever speaking of them again. His grief for his lost family was a quiet, constant ache, and her longing for her home was a sharp, poignant pang. But in sharing the silence, the burdens became easier to bear. He found himself watching her as she worked, admiring the fierce determination in her small frame, the intelligence in her dark eyes. She was not the fragile doll he had first seen, but a woman of profound strength and resilience, a survivor who had met the brutality of this land and refused to be broken by it. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he was repairing a piece of tack, and she was carving another small bird from a piece of pine. The comfortable silence stretched between them, a soft, warm blanket. He found himself thinking about the coming spring, about the thaw, about the mountain passes clearing. The thought that she might leave, that she might take the freedom he had given her and walk out of his life, landed in his chest like a cold stone. This house had been empty for so long, and he hadn't realized how truly empty it was until she had filled it. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to the soft sound of her movements in the next room, to the subtle scent of tea and wood smoke that now clung to the air. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. She looked up from her carving, her dark eyes questioning. He struggled for words, a man unaccustomed to the geography of his own heart. He looked around the room, at the clean hearth, the mended curtains, the small carved bird that sat on the mantelpiece, a silent sentinel. This house, he said, his voice a low rumble. It was just a place to sleep, a shelter from the cold. He met her gaze, his own eyes, once the color of a winter sky, now holding a flicker of warmth, like the first light of dawn. It's quiet, too quiet when you're not in it. It was the most profound declaration he was capable of making. It was not a confession of love, but something deeper, more elemental. It was an admission of need. It was an acknowledgement that she had become the anchor in his drifting world. Mei Lin said nothing. She simply looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw not pity, but a mirror of his own quiet revelation. She set down her carving and her knife. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the vast, moonlit expanse of snow. She was free. She could leave when the thaw came. She could walk away and never look back. But as she stared out at the cold, beautiful, and unforgiving land, she realized she had no desire to. She had been sold, trafficked, and abandoned. But here, in this isolated valley with this broken, honorable man, she had found something she had never expected. She had found a home. She turned back from the window and met his gaze, a small, slow smile gracing her lips for the first time. It was an answer. It was a promise. It was the beginning of a new season.